A white officer in the prison library stomped on a black inmate's book, pages tearing under his boot as the whole room watched in silence. No one moved, no one breathed. Then, the old wall TV flickered on by itself, and a name appeared that shouldn't belong to a man in grays. That was the moment justice began to breathe again, the story of dignity broken, silence that spoke louder than rage, and a man who taught the world what respect really sounds like when it's quiet. Fluorescent lights hummed above the prison library, throwing a cold, colorless glow over shelves lined like obedient soldiers. The air carried the faint scent of bleach and old paper, the kind that held a memory longer than most men in this place. It was Thursday, GED Day. The room was fuller than usual, a low murmur of voices weaving through the aisles as men leaned on end caps or sat shoulder to shoulder at the study tables. At the center of it all, a cart squeaked across the concrete floor, one wheel wobbling like it carried a secret limp. Pushing it, quiet and measured, was Malcolm Reed. He was in grays, name tag stitched over the heart, a thin man, late 50s, with skin like polished walnut and a patience carved from years of knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the talking. He worked that library as if tending a garden no one else believed could grow. Every book straightened was an act of order in a place built for chaos. Every small repair, a torn spine, a bent page, was its own quiet sermon. The door clanged open, and the sound sliced through the hush. Officer Kane stepped in, heavy boots, heavier ego. The badge on his chest caught the light, and the smirk under his mustache said he liked what it meant. "Morning, gentlemen," he drawled. "Didn't know literacy came with such a crowd." He scanned the room and found his favorite target. "Reed," he barked, "still trying to teach the unteachable?" Malcolm didn't look up right away. He slid the last paper back into place, spine even with its brothers, then turned. "Just doing my part, sir." Kane sauntered over, stopping by the cart. His gaze landed on the worn copy of Invisible Man resting on top, dog-eared, mended with clear tape, loved too long to be new. He picked it up between two fingers like it was something that could stain him. "This the best you could find? Invisible Man." He chuckled. "Fitting, isn't it? That's exactly what you are here." No one laughed, not really. There were sounds, half-breaths, half-chuckles, that died in the air. A young inmate named Soto kept his eyes down, pretending to reorganize a stack of worksheets that didn't need touching. Kane flipped the book, skimmed a line, then dropped it to the floor. The slap of it hitting concrete echoed through the room. He put his boot over the cover and ground it slow, heel turning like a man cracking a safe. Paper tore, spine gave way with a sound too soft for the cruelty it carried. "Look at that," he said. "Guess even the classics can't hold up under pressure." The room went still. The volunteer teacher, Clara, froze by her desk, her hand clutching a packet of phonics worksheets she'd been passing out. Her face was pale beneath the fluorescent buzz. She opened her mouth, closed it again. "Officer," she said softly, Maybe you could keep passing out papers, sweetheart," Kane cut in, not looking her way. "Unless you plan on reading him a bedtime story." Malcolm steadied the cart. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough that everyone had to lean toward the silence to hear it. "That book's been through worse, sir," he said. Kane's head tilted. "Oh, has it now?" He took a step closer, boot scraping the cover as he moved. "You think these words make you better than me?" Malcolm's eyes met his, not defiant, not pleading, just level. "No, sir," he said. "They remind me we're the same." The sound that followed wasn't quite silence. It was heavier, denser, like the room had swallowed its own breath. Even the buzzing light above seemed to dim for a heartbeat. Kane's face tightened, the smile turning sharp. "You got yourself a smart mouth, Reed. Maybe too smart for your own good." He kicked the cart. It slammed into a nearby shelf, setting off a small avalanche of paperbacks. Books tumbled like startled birds, hitting the floor with soft thuds. "Clean it up," he said. Malcolm bent, slow, careful. He picked up Invisible Man first. The pages were bent, some torn, but it was still a book. He smoothed the cover with the back of his hand, fingers gentle as if touching a wound that could heal if treated kindly enough. Behind him, Kane folded his arms, watching. "Tell me something, Reed. You ever think you'll be more than this?" Malcolm set the book back on the cart, lining the edges neatly before answering. "Every day, sir," he said, "just not in the way you mean." That made Soto glance up, a quick flash of something between fear and respect. Clara's eyes filled but didn't spill. Breen, one of the guards by the door, shifted his weight and looked away. Kane snorted. "You talk like a preacher," Malcolm smiled faintly. "Used to talk like a teacher. Guess it's all the same when folks stop listening." For a moment, even Kane didn't have a comeback. He stared at Malcolm, jaw working, breath hot with coffee and anger. Then he leaned close enough for only the front row to hear. "Don't forget where you are," he said. "Don't forget who's got the keys." Malcolm met his gaze, still steady. "No, sir," he said. "I never do." Kane straightened, turned to the room. "Back to your reading, gentlemen. You want to end up like this one, thinking he's better because he knows a few words." No one moved. Clara's papers rustled. Somewhere, a scanner beeped faintly, a small embarrassed sound that filled the gap no one dared fill. Kane finally walked off, muttering under his breath, and the room exhaled like it had been holding air for too long. Malcolm stayed crouched by the cart, gathering the last of the fallen books. He stacked them neatly, spine to spine, and wiped a smudge of dirt from the cover of Invisible Man. When he stood, Clara met his eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head. "Don't be," he said. "Some people talk loud because they're scared of hearing themselves." Soto watched from the corner, the ghost of a smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. "You really gonna fix that book again?" he asked. Malcolm looked down at the torn pages in his hand. "A book like this?" he said softly. "It's worth fixing." The lights flickered once. The hum returned. Life in the library went on like nothing had happened, except everyone breathed a little quieter, and every sound felt like it might be the start of something bigger. By noon, the library had warmed by 3 degrees, but nobody could feel it. The fluorescents threw the same thin light, and the vents pushed the same indifferent air. Men shuffled in with their folders and dull pencils like schoolboys built from older bones. Malcolm rolled the cart down the back aisle, testing the wobble with a small shift of his wrist so it wouldn't squeal when it passed the tables. He moved like a man who knew sound had a way of turning against you in a place like this. He lined a dictionary up with its neighbors, tapped the top so the spine sat even, and let his hand rest there a breath longer than necessary, like touching something steady might lend a little steadiness back. Kane entered without hurry, holding a stack of stapled packets as if they were orders from a war only he understood. "Circle up," he said, clapping twice. "GED heroes front and center. Today we do cold reads. Sound it out. No shame." He smiled. Well, a little shame. Motivation. Chairs scraped across concrete. The alphabet rug in the middle had long since lost its bright colors. The letter E looked like it had been stepped on too many times by a man who didn't like the shape of it. Clara took a seat on the rim of the circle, legal pad on her knee, pen capped and uncapped, like hope trying and trying again. Kane tossed a packet to Soto, another to a lifer called T-Bone, who'd been softening over vowels for months, then flicked one toward Malcolm so the staples spun in the air and clipped him across the knuckle. A dot of red lifted and thought better of it. "Read the title, Reed," Kane said. "Leveraging Human Capital in Carceral Environments." "Enlighten us." Malcolm glanced at the page. "It's an opinion piece," he said, voice even. "Author thinks people are systems." "That a complaint or a diagnosis?" Kane asked. "Title? Aloud?" Malcolm gave the commas their breath and the period its chair. The words were dry as chalk, but he read them like they had earned a living once. Soto looked up halfway through the first paragraph, surprised to hear the language give a little when a careful tongue pushed it. T-Bone mouthed along in secret, catching every third word as if he could pocket them before anyone noticed. "Not bad," Kane said, like complimenting a mirror. "All right, Professor. Now help our boy Soto with paragraph 3, from Tangible Outcomes." Malcolm slid his chair closer to the kid, not too close. "Break it," he said softly. "One part at a time. Don't fight the whole word." Soto's finger landed on tangible. "Tan," he tried. "Ja. Bull." "Good," Malcolm said. "Let the B land like a small foot. Try it all together." "Tangible," Soto said, cautious and proud. It put half a smile in his eyes. He flicked a glance at Kane, the way a street dog checks traffic before crossing. Kane leaned forward, boot edging Malcolm's chair leg until the wood pressed Malcolm's knee. Dominance by furniture. Cute, he said. Now spell chrysanthemum, library boy. He drew the vowels out like taffy. Clara's pen stilled. Breen, by the door, shifted his stance and stared at the clock like time might defend him if it came to blows. There was a hush you could hold in your hand. Malcolm didn't reach for the show. He kept his eyes on Soto. Chrysanthemum, he said, calm as a man folding a shirt. Chrysanthemum. Lucky guess, Kane said too fast. He turned on the room. You all hear that? Flowers in prison. Maybe next we knit. A few men laughed because laughter is armor, thin but available. The sound felt borrowed and came back late. Kane pushed to his feet again, pacing the circle. Reading is power, he announced like it was his idea. So let's see who's weak. He planted a packet in front of T-Bone. Paragraph 5. Start with recidivism. T-Bone's mouth worked. The R got stuck on the edge of his teeth. Malcolm angled his voice toward him without stealing his turn. Recidivism, he said, tapping the syllables on the table with a finger that knew patience like muscle memory. Recidivism, T-Bone said, surprised at himself, the word landing whole. For a half-second, his face looked 10 years younger, like a window had opened where a wall had been. Kane's lip curled. Enough coaching, he said. We're not handing out gold stars. He snatched the packet back, tossed it to Clara hard enough that a staple snagged her sleeve. You read it, sweetheart, since our scholar here needs a tutor. Clara's cheeks flushed the way light sometimes pretends to be heat. I'm here to assist, officer, she said, voice steady because it had to be. Everyone here is capable of learning. You hear that, Reed? Kane asked, as if Malcolm had been the one to doubt it. Even the volunteers believe in you. He let his attention hover, the kind that bruises. On your knees. Pick up the paperbacks you threw earlier. Malcolm didn't turn his head toward the 3 paperbacks in the shadow under the low shelf, books no one had noticed until the angle of the day shifted. He could have reached them from where he sat. He stood instead. For 2 long beats he let the act be a choice that belonged to him. Then he bent, not kneeling, not submitting, bent the way a man bends to work. He slid each book free with his fingertips and brushed the grit from the edges like a barber dusting a neck. Kane's face colored, an angry bloom. He took a step and set his palm flat against Malcolm's shoulder, a nudge with the mean part of a boyhood no one had corrected. Malcolm had to plant his feet to keep from rocking back. Breen cleared his throat and then swallowed the sound like a man hiding contraband. Soto's jaw set so hard a vein showed at his temple. On your knees, Kane said again, voice lifted for witnesses. Say, yes, sir. Say, thank you, sir. Malcolm placed the last book on the cart, laid it neat, squared the corners against the world. He straightened slowly so the moment couldn't be stolen. I'm working, sir, he said. You asked me to clean up. The line split the room into people who heard defiance and people who heard dignity. Clara heard both and decided one of them was louder. She stood. It surprised her. Officer, she said, and her voice didn't shake this time. We're losing the hour. Kane turned on her. We lost the hour when you started running a tea party, he snapped. Sit. She sat because there are orders and there is survival, and sometimes the cost of one pays the bill for the other. Her eyes met Malcolm's on the way down, and he gave the smallest nod, the kind you only see if you're looking for a reason to keep going. Back to it, Kane said to the room. Soto, read from the top. Read, if he trips, you keep your hands folded and your teacher voice in your pocket. Soto began, halting, then steadier, each syllable like a rung on a ladder he wasn't sure would hold. Tan, Gee, Blee out, comes. He pushed through, and by the time he reached the end of the paragraph, he had sweat at his hairline and a grin he tried to hide. Malcolm let out a breath he hadn't noticed he was keeping. Good, he said, so quiet only the boy could be sure he'd heard it. Kane pretended boredom, flipping through his copy, but his eyes were bright with a hunger that never learned the difference between respect and applause. He tapped a knuckle against Malcolm's chest pocket, where a small, careful square of paper made a faint outline beneath the fabric. What's that? He asked. A note, Malcolm said, from a student. Read it. Kane held out his hand. Malcolm didn't move. The room tilted a fraction, and the wobble in the cart announced itself like a timid cough. "It's not part of the lesson, sir." "It is now," Khan said. He reached as if to pluck it himself. Breen stepped forward one pace, just one. "Officer," he said, not loud, not soft, "leave the man be." Kane froze, eyes cutting sideways. The room heard the line drawn and leaned closer to see if anyone would step over it. Kane's smile came back slow. "Stand down, Sergeant," he said without looking. "Or take a seat and I'll test you next." Breen's jaw worked. He stopped where he was, which in its own small way was a kind of refusal. Clara's hands tightened in her lap until the knuckles went white. Kane let the moment pass, the way a cat lets a bird fly a foot before pouncing again. He dropped his hand from Malcolm's chest and pointed to the packet instead. "Fine," he said. "Back to human capital. Tell me why any of this matters, Reed. Sell me church." Malcolm looked at the men gathered, faces carved by bad choices and worse luck and the daily weather of a place that wanted to keep them small. He set a finger on the page, not to preach, just to anchor. "Because a man who can read a form can argue a point," he said. "A man who can read a letter can write one back. A man who can read the room might stop something from getting worse." Khan rolled his eyes, but something in the room answered like a tuning fork. Soto lifted his chin. T-Bone whispered the new word to himself again just to feel it fit. Kane clapped his hands once, sharp. "Fun talk," he said. "Class dismissed. Reed, you'll reshelve westerns, check numbers, count them out loud so we all know you can. And if I hear you mumble a prayer in my classroom, I'll have you mopping the tier till your knees remember who's in charge." Malcolm collected the packets, stacked them square, and set them on Clara's desk with a quiet "thank you" that reached her like a coat in cold weather. She blinked and nodded, and didn't trust her voice. As the circle broke, the room filled with small sounds again. Chairs, feet, the distant rattle of a cart in another corridor. Soto drifted past Malcolm and paused just long enough to say, without moving his mouth, "You good?" "I'm good," Malcolm said. He wasn't, not exactly, but the words were true enough to stand on while the floor settled. He took the cart to the westerns, crouched by the bottom shelf, and read each tiny label number as if numbers themselves could be persuaded to behave. He felt the square of paper in his pocket like a warm thing, like a coal wrapped in cloth. He kept his eyes on the work because the work had a way of keeping its eyes on him. When he rose, the wobble had quieted. The titles faced out. The line of spines looked like a promise made by hand. Kane lingered by the door, keys at his belt, the sound they made saying more than he could with a mouth full of authority. "See you at count, library boy," he said. "Try not to get your feelings on the carpet." Malcolm nodded once and said nothing. Clara watched him from behind her desk, something like resolve settling where fear had camped all morning. Breen held the door as men filed out. He didn't meet Malcolm's eyes, but when Malcolm passed, Breen dipped his head a fraction, the way a man might nod to a neighbor over a fence he didn't build and couldn't move. The hour ended. The library remembered to breathe just a little. Outside, a cart rolled by and the distant beep of a scanner marked time like a metronome. Inside, Malcolm rested his palm on the cart handle, took one long, slow breath, and made ready to open the room again. The supply closet behind the library smelled of glue, old tape, and time. It was where Malcolm went when the room outside got too loud with silence. He sat on the small stool by the paper cutter, smoothing a folded letter across his knee. The paper was thin now, soft at the edges, handled too many times. The ink had bled in one corner where a drop of water, maybe sweat, maybe something else, had once fallen. The handwriting was careful, rounded, the kind that took its time. "Dear Dad," it began. "I learned a new word today. Chrysanthemum. My teacher says it's the flower that means truth. I drew one for you. Maybe they grow where you are." Beneath it, in blue pen, was the drawing, a circle of petals that looked more like sunlight than a bloom. Malcolm traced it with his thumb, the tip rough from years of work. He could almost feel the boy's breath in the loops of the letters, could hear Elijah's voice sounding out the syllables slow and proud. Chris and the mum, like he'd climbed a mountain and finally reached the name of it. He folded the letter again, not to hide it, but to keep it from breaking. He'd carried it every day for 3 years, tucked in his chest pocket like a small, stubborn heartbeat. Some nights, when the tear went quiet and the hum of the vents turned into the sound of memory, he'd pull it out under the weak glow of the cell light, reading it again until the words steadied him. Before this place, he'd been a teacher, a real one. Chalk and bulletin boards and kids with too much noise in them. He taught English at a public school outside Atlanta. The walls were cracked, but the laughter was clean. Then came the day the police rolled through after a fight behind the gym, sirens cutting the air to ribbons. One of his students, a boy named Darius, ended up face down on the asphalt. Wrong place, wrong color, wrong hour. Malcolm had stepped between Darius and a uniform who looked too young to know the difference between fear and authority. The uniform pressed charges, the department circled wagons, and suddenly a man with 20 years in classrooms was an aggressor. He'd taken a plea for a thing he didn't do because the alternative meant leaving Elijah fatherless. He'd promised the boy he'd be back before the next school year. That was 5 Septembers ago. Now the only lessons he gave were to men who'd forgotten what it meant to learn. And still, every time one of them finished a page without stumbling, he felt that same quiet rush, the kind a father feels when his child takes a first step, even if no one else claps. A soft knock came at the door. Clara's voice slipped through the crack. "Mr. Reed, you busy?" He pocketed the letter. "Never too busy for books," he said. She stepped in, holding a clipboard tight against her chest. Her hair was pulled back, but a few strands had escaped, catching the overhead light. "I wanted to check the supply log," she said, eyes darting to the half-open drawer. "And maybe apologize for earlier." Malcolm smiled, small and tired. "You didn't do anything wrong, Miss Clara." "I didn't do anything right either," she exhaled. "The way he talks to you, it's not right." He shrugged. "The world's been teaching that lesson a long time. I just stopped signing the attendance sheet." She almost smiled at that. "You ever think about quitting the library?" "Every morning," he said. "Then I think about who'd fix the dictionaries when they fall apart." Clara's gaze fell on the small verse written on the inside of the cabinet door in pencil. "Let every word that passes your lips be seasoned, so even the hard bread can be eaten." "That's scripture?" she asked. "Sort of," he said. "It's what I remember of it. The rest got lost somewhere between here and the last place I was free." She nodded, tracing the line with her eyes. "It sounds right enough." He leaned back, fingers interlaced. "You ever wonder why people like Cain get so angry at words?" She looked puzzled. "Angry? Words make men equal," Malcolm said. "Once you can read, no one can lie to you in print. They can still lie with tone, uniform, badge. But paper's honest. Paper holds its breath and waits for the truth." For a long time, she didn't speak. Then, softly, "You're still a teacher." He chuckled, low and dry. "Only difference is the walls listen now." The door creaked again. Breen stood there, one shoulder against the frame, pretending to check the time. "Reed," he said, "you got a minute?" "Always, Sergeant." Breen stepped in halfway, keeping his voice low. "Word is, Kane's running his mouth upstairs. Says you're building a fan club in his class." Malcolm rubbed his jaw. "Man confuses decency with disobedience." "Yeah," Breen said. "He's not the first." His eyes softened. "Just keep your head down. You don't want to give him a reason." "Men like him don't need reasons," Malcolm said. "They need mirrors." Breen almost smiled. "Don't let him break yours." He turned to go, paused. "That letter in your pocket," he said quietly. "You read it every day?" Malcolm hesitated. "More or less." "Good," Breen said. "Keep doing that. Reminds you there's still paper outside these walls." When the door closed, Malcolm sat for a long moment, the hum of the light above filling the small space. He thought about Elijah's word. Chrysanthemum. Truth. A flower that means truth. He wondered if the boy had any idea how right he was. Later, when the library emptied and the room went gray with evening, Malcolm rolled the cart back to its place, checked the tape rolls, and wrote 3 new words in his notebook: parole, apology, father. He wrote them slow, then beneath each one, a sentence that tried to fix something no law ever could. Under father, he wrote, teach the boy how to stand tall even when the floor shakes. The next morning would bring Cain again, and the noise, and the looks. But for now, there was only the smell of paper and glue, the sound of pencil scratching against a ruled line, and the memory of a small voice saying a long word right for the very first time. It was enough to keep the light steady for one more night. The morning started with the sound of keys and laughter that didn't belong to Joy. Kane's voice carried ahead of him, sharp as the metal on his belt. The library was already half full, men seated, pencils tapping, pages turning like cautious breaths. Clara stood near the front table, arranging comprehension packets. She looked up when the door opened, her smile thin and professional. The moment she saw Kane, it faltered, then steadied itself into something polite enough to pass inspection. "Morning, class," Kane said, dropping a folder onto her desk. "Today we're testing progress. Nothing fancy, just a little public reading to see if your brains still work." He turned to Malcolm, who was adjusting a cart of returns near the corner. "Reed, why don't you kick us off? Show the boys how the state's investment is paying off." Malcolm didn't flinch. He wiped his hands on his gray slacks, walked to the circle of chairs, and took the sheet Clara offered him. "Opinion essay," she murmured. He nodded once, the kind of acknowledgement that said thank you without words. Kane leaned back against a shelf, arms crossed, watching. "Loud and proud, Professor." Malcolm began to read. His voice was calm, unhurried. He gave rhythm to the punctuation, made the sentences sound like they had weight. For a moment, even the walls seemed to listen. The piece was about rehabilitation, about how education was the only thing that didn't rust behind bars. The irony was thick enough to taste. Halfway through, Kane shifted. "Enough of that. Soto, take over." Soto hesitated, his hand trembling on the page. "From where?" "From leveraging," Kane said, smirking. "That's your word of the day." Soto stumbled once, twice. His voice broke on the fourth line. Malcolm leaned closer, his tone low and kind. "Split it up," he said. "Leverage. Little levers move big things." Soto tried again, and the word came out clean. There was a small sound from the back, one of the older men clapping once before stopping himself. Kane's head snapped up. "Cute," he said. "A real teacher and his pet. Maybe next week you can read me bedtime stories." He strode over, yanked the paper from Soto's hand, and tossed it back at Malcolm. "You think you run this room, Reed? You think these men respect you?" "I think they're learning," Malcolm said softly. "Learning?" Kane laughed, high and hollow. "Learning what exactly? How to talk pretty before they die in here?" He snatched another stack of papers from Clara's desk, crumpled the top one, and threw it. The corner of the staple caught Malcolm's cheek, a small red line blooming just below his eye. "There," Kane said. "Lesson in humility." Clara gasped. "Officer Kane?" "Stay out of it," he barked. "You're here to take notes, not give them." Breen, by the door, straightened but didn't move. His jaw flexed like he was chewing his tongue. The other inmates sat frozen, afraid that even sympathy might be contagious. Malcolm touched the cut lightly, looked at the blood on his fingertips, and said nothing. Kane's grin widened. "What's the matter, preacher? Out of sermons?" Malcolm's voice was low enough that the air had to lean in to hear. A man doesn't have to raise his voice to tell the truth. That only fed Kane's anger. He picked up the stack of books beside the cart, paperbacks, some repaired with tape, and flung them down. "Then clean up your truth." Malcolm bent, slow, deliberate. He didn't kneel. He bent the way a craftsman bends to his work. One book at a time, he picked them up, brushed off the dust, aligned the corners. The muscles in his forearms flexed under the fabric of his shirt, the steady movement somehow more dignified than anything in the room. Kane's voice rose. "I said on your knees!" He stepped forward, hand landing on Malcolm's shoulder, shoving hard enough that the older man had to plant his feet to keep balance. The room shrank. The sound of breathing filled it, thick and uneven. Clara pressed her hand to her chest. Soto's fingers tightened around his pencil until it snapped. Breen took one step closer, then stopped, the word "don't" dying behind his teeth. Malcolm didn't fight back. He looked up at Kane, his voice a whisper that still carried. "I'm doing what you asked, sir. Picking up what's fallen." That single line tilted something in the air. The other men looked at him differently now, not pitying, but watching. Kane felt it too, the weight of their eyes. He shoved again, harder this time, needing the world to see that he still owned it. "You like to play martyr? Fine, be one." The fluorescent light above flickered once, a small electric pop, and went steady again. Malcolm reached for the last book, a thin paperback about American poetry, its spine half torn. He placed it carefully on top of the pile. Then came the sound no one expected. A faint click from the ceiling corner, the old wall-mounted television turning itself on. The screen glowed blue, then white, then filled with the seal of the Department of Corrections. A recorded voice cut through the room. "Welcome to this year's Educational Program Recognition Ceremony, live from the state capitol." Kane laughed uneasily. "Well, look at that. Guess even God's got cable." He turned to the men. "Eyes front, gentlemen. Maybe one of you made the honor roll." No one answered. Every gaze was fixed on the screen. The camera panned across a podium, flags in the background, a woman in a dark suit adjusting the microphone. "Today," she said, "we celebrate the individuals who have made measurable contributions to literacy and rehabilitation across our facilities. Their work reminds us that knowledge is freedom, even behind walls." Kane's grin faltered. Clara's hand was still over her heart, but her eyes were locked on the broadcast. Malcolm stood motionless, the blue glow painting his face like a calm ocean. The woman continued, reading from her paper. "We begin with Ravenhill State Facility, Site B, pilot program for the Father-Son Dictionary Initiative, lead mentor, M. Reed." It hit the room like thunder without sound. Kane's mouth opened, then closed. Breen's eyes flicked from the screen to the man beside the cart. Soto whispered, "That's you," like a prayer he hadn't meant to say aloud. Malcolm didn't move. His hands rested on the cart's handle, knuckles white but steady. On the screen, a slide appeared showing a scanned page from a report, handwritten notes in neat lines, the signature at the bottom clear as daylight, M. Reed, mentor lead. For a heartbeat, nobody breathed. Then Kane took a half-step forward, voice cracking. "Turn that off." No one did. Clara's eyes glistened. Breen looked at Kane the way a man looks at a mirror after years of avoiding it. The only sound was the voice from the TV, calm, official, and merciless. "And for his outstanding service, program founder M. Reed will receive a commendation letter to be added to his personnel file and credit toward early release." The fluorescent hum filled the pause that followed. Kane's hand twitched toward his belt but found nothing useful there. The authority that had always answered when he called it was suddenly out of reach. Malcolm lifted his gaze, the blue reflection still on his skin, and met Kane's eyes. "Guess the lesson's not over," he said quietly. Kane's face went red, then pale. He turned away, muttering something no one caught. The men in the room stayed silent, each one feeling the air shift, a pressure breaking somewhere unseen. Clara took a step forward, her voice small but steady. "Congratulations, Mr. Reed." Malcolm nodded once. "Thank you, ma'am." The television kept talking, names and numbers scrolling like scripture, but no one was listening anymore. The truth had already filled the room, and there wasn't space left for anything else. The television's glow spilled across the rows of books like a sunrise no one had asked for. It painted the faces in that room, men, guards, teacher, with a light that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with truth. The announcer's voice carried on, warm and official, naming programs and figures, describing improvements in literacy rates as if this was just another ceremony in a world that didn't know how much weight a name could carry. But inside the library, every word sounded like a verdict. Kane's voice broke the trance first. "Turn it off," he said, sharp but quieter than before. Nobody moved. Clara's eyes glistened, fixed on the screen as if she was afraid to blink. Breen stood like a statue near the door, one hand brushing the radio at his hip but not lifting it. The inmates sat frozen, the kind of stillness that only comes when a room realizes it's watching something sacred. On screen, the woman in the dark suit smiled faintly. "The Father-Son Dictionary Project," she said, "was built by an incarcerated mentor who understood that learning doesn't end when a door locks. His model now serves as the foundation for Site C and D programs statewide." The camera shifted to a slide showing the printed workflow document, the signature again in clear black ink, M. Reed. Malcolm didn't speak. He stood with his hands on the cart, eyes on the floor, jaw working like he was holding the moment still until it made sense. Kane turned toward him, searching for something to grab, mockery, authority, control, but came up empty. He looked smaller now, his confidence leaking through the cracks in his silence. "That's not," he started, but the words fell apart halfway. Then came the sound of the door. The heavy latch clicked open, and the warden walked in. 2 administrators followed, one holding a clipboard, the other a manila folder. They didn't rush. Their calm was worse than shouting. The warden's face was the color of stone left in the sun too long. "Officer Kane," he said. Kane stiffened. "Sir." "Your keys," the warden said. No explanation, no anger, just procedure, the kind that left no room for argument. Kane didn't move. The men in the room could feel the weight of that pause, the way authority shifted from his belt to the space between his fingers. "Sir, Keys," the warden repeated, eyes flat. "And your badge. You're being placed on administrative leave pending review." He nodded to the administrator. "Programs and HR will handle the file." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Soto blinked slowly, as if trying to believe what his eyes already knew. Breen exhaled through his nose, the sound small but certain. Kane's fingers went to his belt, unhooking the ring. The metal clinked like wind chimes that had forgotten how to sound pretty. He placed them on the desk, next to the scattered worksheets and a lone pencil broken in half. His badge followed. The moment the metal touched wood, the air changed. It felt lighter, but no one dared breathe. The warden turned toward Malcolm. "Mr. Reed," he said, using the title without thinking about it, "it seems your documentation was thorough." Malcolm inclined his head once. "Just keeping records, sir." "That's what good men do," the warden said. He looked around the room, letting his gaze rest briefly on Clara, on Breen, on the faces of the inmates who had watched the whole thing unfold. "Gentlemen," he said to them, "we all learned something today. Some lessons come harder than others." He nodded to the administrators. "Start with the complaint log. There are dates and signatures to verify." Kane's voice rose, desperate. "You can't take his word over mine. He's a convict." The warden didn't raise his voice. "He's also the reason this facility just received its first state commendation in a decade." That silenced him. Kane's mouth opened again, but no sound came out. He stared at Malcolm, searching for fury, for triumph, for something he could fight. But Malcolm's face held neither. It held only stillness, the kind that came from surviving storms without ever learning to hate the rain. The administrators began taking notes. Papers shuffled. The television droned on in the background, still listing awards, still talking about programs in progress. The voice was steady, polite, and unstoppable. Clara approached Malcolm quietly. "You filed the reports," she whispered. "I thought maybe it was the warden." He shook his head. "No, ma'am, I just wrote what happened. No adjectives, just verbs and dates. Sometimes verbs do the heavy lifting." Breen stepped forward, rubbing the back of his neck. "For what it's worth," he said, "I should have said something sooner." Malcolm met his eyes. "For what it's worth," he replied, "you just did." The warden motioned to the guards at the door. "Escort Officer Kane to processing." Kane turned, his boots suddenly too heavy for the floor. As he passed Malcolm, he hesitated. There was something wild behind his eyes, a mix of shame and disbelief that had nowhere left to go. He opened his mouth, maybe to curse, maybe to apologize, but no sound came out. He kept walking. The door shut behind him with a sound too soft to fit the day. When the noise died, only the hum of the lights remained. The warden straightened his tie. "Mr. Reed," he said, "you'll receive official notice by tomorrow. Programs wants your input on expanding Site C next month. We'll coordinate with custody about your file." "Understood," Malcolm said. "Good." The warden looked at Clara. "Thank you for your patience, ma'am. You were right to keep the room steady." He glanced once more at Breen. "Sergeant." Then he left the way he came, calm, deliberate, door closing behind him like the final page of a long, heavy book. No one spoke for a long while. The television went quiet on its own, the screen freezing on the state seal. Soto shifted in his chair. "You really built that dictionary thing?" he asked, voice rough with awe. Malcolm nodded. "Fathers and sons writing each other again, words they both understand. It's simple work." "Simple don't mean small," Soto said. Malcolm smiled faintly. "No, it doesn't." Breen cleared his throat. "Library's yours for the hour, Mr. Reed." The word "Mr." lingered, gentle and deliberate, like a handshake between men who had learned something the hard way. Malcolm looked around the room. the scattered papers, the chairs askew, the books that had fallen and now waited to be lifted. He took a breath. "All right then," he said. "Back to it." Clara blinked, still trying to process the calm in his voice. "Back to what?" "Reading," he said simply. "We've got hard words to tame." He turned to the men and gestured for Soto to pick up where they'd left off. The young man started reading, his voice halting at first, then steadier. The room, still wrapped in aftershock, began to remember its rhythm. Clara sat down at the desk, eyes glassy but smiling. She wrote a note at the top of her page: "Respect is quiet work." Breen lingered near the door, arms crossed. When Soto finished the paragraph, he said softly, "Good job, son." The boy looked up, startled, then nodded, the corners of his mouth twitching into something like pride. Malcolm adjusted the stack of papers, lined up the pencils, and smoothed the tablecloth with a careful hand. Outside, the sun was angling through the narrow windows, hitting the dust just right so it looked like gold. He caught his reflection in the TV screen, older, thinner, but still standing. For the first time in years, the room didn't feel cold. The door shut behind Kane, and the sound hung in the air longer than it should have, like the room was making sure it was real. For a moment, no one spoke. The men were still sitting in their mismatched chairs, their hands halfway between tension and disbelief. Clara wiped at her cheek, pretending it was just dust. Breen leaned his shoulder against the wall, arms crossed, eyes on the floor as though looking anywhere else might betray how relieved he was. The hum of the lights came back slowly, thin and steady, filling the space Kane's voice had once filled. Malcolm stood beside the cart, his hand resting on the metal handle. The cut on his cheek had dried, leaving a faint trace of red that looked more like a memory than a wound. He wasn't smiling, not really, but the corners of his mouth carried the kind of peace a man earns after years of holding it in reserve. He glanced at the TV, still frozen on the state seal, then at the papers scattered across the table. "We'll need to clean this up," he said softly. Soto was the first to move. He bent down, gathering fallen pages, aligning edges that had never met before. "You want me to file these back, Mr. Reed?" The name came out awkwardly, half question, half apology for all the days he hadn't used it. Malcolm looked up. "Yeah," he said. "That'd be fine." Clara rose from her chair, her eyes still bright. "You're really not angry?" He shook his head. "Anger's quick. It burns up before it reaches the places that need warming." Breen let out something between a sigh and a chuckle. "Guess that's one way to put it." He stepped forward, unhooked his keyring from his belt, and set it down on the edge of Clara's desk. "Library's yours for the hour, Mr. Reed. That's the order." Malcolm's eyes softened. "Appreciate it, Sergeant." Breen nodded once. "You earned it." He turned to leave but hesitated near the door. "You know, it's been a while since anyone called you by your first name in this place." "Feels strange?" Malcolm asked. "Feels right," Breen said, and left without looking back. For a few seconds, the room just breathed. It felt like the world outside had forgotten to knock. Then, Malcolm straightened the stack of forms on the desk, wiped the dust from the corner where Kane's boot had struck earlier, and looked at the circle of men still sitting there. "All right," he said quietly, the calm returning to his tone. "Back to it." Soto blinked. "Back to what?" "Back to reading," Malcolm said. "We've still got words that think they can scare us." The men looked at each other, half confused, half amused, and one by one they picked up their packets. Soto started reading again, stumbling once on a long sentence, but finding his rhythm faster than before. Every time he hesitated, Malcolm leaned in just enough to catch him, his voice barely above a whisper. "Break it apart. Let it breathe." Clara sat at her desk, pretending to take notes, though her hand trembled with a feeling she didn't have a name for. She'd seen men fight in this room, fists, rage, hopeless defiance, but never this kind of quiet defiance, the kind that rebuilt rather than broke. When Soto finished, Malcolm nodded. "Good. Now tell me what it means." Soto frowned. "It means, I don't know, it's about power, right? About leverage?" Malcolm smiled. "That's part of it, but sometimes leverage isn't about strength. It's about where you choose to stand." Soto thought about that, brow furrowed, then nodded. Yeah, I get that." The room seemed to ease with him. T-Bone cracked his knuckles, muttering something about finally understanding a word that had been haunting him all week. Even Clara laughed, the sound soft but real. The library, once cold and tense, had become something else, warmer, alive, almost human again. When the hour neared its end, the warden returned with the same two administrators, though their faces looked lighter this time. "Mr. Reed," the warden said, taking off his hat, "Program sends their thanks. They'll be sending materials for the next site's training. You'll assist with that once we sort logistics." Malcolm stood, hands folded in front of him. "Happy to help, sir." The warden nodded. "And you'll have a commendation placed in your file. Officially. Took long enough." He paused, the hint of a smile trying to form. "Sometimes it takes a storm to see who's still standing when the clouds clear." Malcolm inclined his head. "Storms don't scare me much anymore." "I can tell," the warden said. He turned toward Clara. "Miss, thank you for staying calm." Then to the room. "Gentlemen, you've got a good thing here. Try not to lose it." When they left, the door closed gently, no slam, no echo. For once, the sound was polite. Soto exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "You really ain't gonna rub it in, huh?" "What happened to him?" Malcolm shook his head. "Humiliation doesn't teach what it thinks it does." "Then what does?" "Patience," Malcolm said. "Consistency, maybe mercy when it's earned." Clara looked at him. "You really believe that? After everything?" He smiled a little. "Belief's like reading. You lose it if you stop practicing." The men chuckled softly. It wasn't laughter that erased pain. It was the kind that made space for it, the kind that knew pain didn't have to own the whole room. When the session ended, they lined up to sign out pencils and check out books. Soto lingered at the front of the line, a battered dictionary in his hands. "You ever going to tell your boy what happened today?" he asked. Malcolm thought for a second, then shook his head. "He'll hear it when I write him. Stories travel better when they take the long way." Soto nodded, hugging the dictionary like a prize. "Guess that's true." When the last man left, Malcolm stood alone with Clara. The afternoon sun was fading through the high windows, turning the dust into a shimmer that looked like gold flakes suspended in air. She watched him gather the books and straighten the chairs, every gesture deliberate, graceful even in exhaustion. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, "you ever going to fix that cartwheel?" He smiled. "Maybe, but sometimes a wobble reminds you you're moving." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just smiled back. The clock ticked. The air settled. For the first time since she'd started volunteering, Clara didn't feel like an outsider here. She felt like part of something that, against every rule, had turned decent. When she left, Malcolm walked the perimeter of the library one last time. He ran his hand along the shelf where Invisible Man sat again, the tape on its spine smooth under his fingers. He placed a small scrap of paper inside, a petal torn from an old flyer, folded neat. Then he locked the cabinet, flicked off the lights, and stood for a moment in the near dark. The hum faded, the quiet settled. In the reflection of the glass, his outline looked taller than it had that morning. For once, the library didn't feel like a cage. It felt like proof that even walls could learn the meaning of respect. Saturday mornings were quieter inside Ravenhill. No GED class, no count interruptions except the routine walkthroughs. The library, for once, sounded like it was meant to. Pages turning, pencils scratching, low conversation that didn't need to hide. Malcolm unlocked the door early, letting the smell of floor wax and paper settle before anyone else arrived. On the corner of his desk sat an envelope with a blue stamp that said, "Family Education Day." He'd seen it tacked to the bulletin for weeks, but never thought it would reach him. Yet there it was, his name written in the careful hand of someone who still believed the mail could carry miracles. By 9 o'clock, the hallway outside hummed with visiting voices. Fathers meeting sons, wives and mothers carrying Tupperware and hopes that smelled like cinnamon. Malcolm stood near the back shelf, smoothing the wrinkles from his shirt, unsure whether to sit or keep standing. He'd seen other men prepare for visits before. Some turned jittery, some pretended not to care. He felt both at once. Clara arrived first, carrying a box of donated books. "They told me to help set up for the families," she said, but the look in her eyes gave her away. She already knew who was coming. "You don't have to stay," Malcolm said. "I want to," she replied. Besides, you'll need someone to take the picture. He chuckled softly. A picture, huh? Guess that's proof I still exist. Before she could answer, the door opened again. Breen stepped in, holding a clipboard. Visitor for you, Reed. His tone was different now, stripped of the authority he used to hide behind. Kid's got your eyes. Elijah stood beside him, taller than the memory Malcolm carried, face thinner but still round at the cheeks, the same wide gaze that had once asked too many questions about everything. The boy clutched a folder and a small sketchbook. For a moment, Malcolm couldn't move. Then the air remembered how to move his lungs. Hey, Dad, Elijah said, quiet but clear. Malcolm blinked. Hey, yourself. He started to extend his hand, then changed his mind and pulled the boy into a hug. Elijah didn't resist. The hug was awkward, long overdue, and more healing than either of them would admit. Breen cleared his throat, pretending to study the clipboard. You got 40 minutes. I'll be by the door. Clara stood off to the side, watching with a smile that came easy this time. You want me to? Malcolm nodded toward the camera hanging from her wrist. Yeah, might as well catch proof before it fades. She lifted it, took one quiet photo. No pose, no smile. Just father and son standing under the same tired light, the dust between them glowing like gold. Elijah pulled back, holding up the sketchbook. I brought this, he said. My teacher showed the class that TV thing, said my dad helped people learn to read. Everyone clapped. I told them you used to teach me. Too, Malcolm's throat tightened. Your teacher showed that? The broadcast? Yeah, they said your name. Elijah opened the book. Inside were doodles, flowers, faces, a few half-finished words. One page was a careful drawing of a chrysanthemum, petals outlined in blue. I still remember the word, he said proudly. Spelled it right this time. Clara let out a small laugh. He's better than most of my students. Malcolm knelt beside his son, fingers tracing the drawing without touching it. That's beautiful, he said. Looks just like truth. Elijah grinned. You said that before, in your letters. I meant it both times. They sat at one of the study tables. The world around them felt smaller, safer. Breen leaned on the wall, pretending not to listen. Clara unpacked a small bag of cookies she'd brought from home, sliding them across the table like contraband. So what do you do here? Elijah asked, glancing around. Mostly fix things, Malcolm said. Books, shelves, people when I can. You fix people? Sometimes. Words help. He pointed to the row of dictionaries along the back wall. That's what the project was about. Teaching dads to write to their kids so their kids can write back. Elijah thought about it, chewing a cookie. Do you write for them too? I used to. Then I made them start on their own. You can't borrow someone else's voice forever. The boy smiled at that, eyes gleaming. That's what Mom says about excuses. Malcolm laughed. Smart woman, your mother. She's proud of you, Elijah said suddenly, voice softer. She didn't think she'd ever say that again. Malcolm looked down at his hands, the scars and ink stains that never quite washed away. She has a right not to. Maybe, Elijah said, but she does anyway. The silence that followed was gentle, not awkward. Clara watched them from the desk, eyes wet but shining. Breen checked the clock, then walked over and placed something on the table, a new pen, dark blue with a silver clip. Found this on Kane's old desk, he said. Figured it belonged to you more than him. Malcolm turned it in his hand, feeling the weight. Thank you, Breen shrugged. Just don't make me regret it. I'll only use it for good, Malcolm said, smiling faintly. Elijah leaned closer. You gonna write with it? I already started, Malcolm said. Today counts. Breen gave a nod and stepped back to the door. 5 more minutes. The boy slid a piece of paper across the table, the same drawing of the chrysanthemum now signed with both their initials. You can keep it, he said. Malcolm folded it carefully, slipping it into his pocket. It'll stay right here. He tapped his chest. Next to the old one. Clara snapped one last photo, the two of them bent over the table, heads close, the kind of picture that explained more than any story could. When the guards began ushering visitors out, Elijah stood uncertain, then hugged him again. This time it wasn't awkward. You'll be home soon, he whispered. One day at a time, Malcolm said. That's how the big things happen. The boy nodded, pulled away, and joined the line of families moving toward the exit. The door shut softly behind them, leaving the faint smell of cookies and hope behind. Clara came over, her voice trembling. "You okay?" He smiled. "Better than okay." She wiped her eyes, laughing at herself. "Guess I'm not built for goodbyes." "They're just pauses," he said. "If you listen close, you can still hear the rest of the sentence coming." Breen returned the clipboard to his belt. "You run a good class, Mr. Reed," he said quietly. "Keep it steady." "I intend to," Malcolm said. As they left him alone again, the library filled with the sound of pages settling, the dust dancing in the afternoon light. He opened the pen Breen had given him, pressed it to a fresh page in his notebook, and began to write. "Dear Elijah, today the world felt right for a minute. You were here, and for once I didn't need to fix anything." He set the pen down, leaned back, and watched the sunlight crawl across the floor. Somewhere down the hall, a door clanged shut, but it didn't sound like an ending anymore. It sounded like rhythm. Evening settled into the library the way a hymn settles into a room that's done talking. The fluorescents were still up there, steady as ever, but the sun had shouldered in from the west and laid a warm stripe across the carpet, turning the dust to gold. Malcolm stood in that stripe for a long time, long enough to feel it climb his shoes and warm the threadbare knees of his grays. In the silence, you could hear small things. A page breathing as it turned itself back to flat, the light click of the wall clock changing its mind, the cart's soft wobble as if it wanted the last word and had finally learned to whisper. He took Invisible Man from the repair shelf and pressed the tape down one more time with the edge of his thumb. The cover was never going to be pretty again, but it would hold. That counted for more than pretty in this place. He slid a scrap of paper inside, just a petal cut from an old flyer, folded neat, and set the book at eye level where men reach on instinct when they're ready to try again. A person deserves to meet his reflection at the height of his hope. Clara came in with a tote bag and that lopsided smile she wore when something inside her was heavier than her bones, but not heavier than her spirit. "Figured you might need a few more notebooks," she said, setting the bag on the desk. "The cheap kind. The kind that forgive mistakes if you don't press too hard." "Forgiving paper," Malcolm said. "That's a service." She took in the room, softer now, like a place after a storm where the leaves are still dripping but the air already smells like tomorrow. "You all right?" "I'm steady," he said. "That's different than all right." "It's better," he answered, and she knew enough about him by then to let that stand. Breen's shadow filled the doorway before he did. He'd shaved the angles off his day. Without the keys, he looked like a man who could hear himself think. "Program sent over a schedule," he said, tapping the doorframe with his knuckles. "Site C wants your notes on Monday. I told him you'd want to keep the hour here." "I do," Malcolm said. Breen nodded. "Then you keep it." He looked at the card as if it were a living thing. "You ever going to get that wheel fixed?" "Maybe," Malcolm said. "A little wobble reminds you the floor's real." Breen chuckled. "You talk like my grandfather when he'd had just enough coffee to start telling the truth." He turned to go, and then paused. "For what it's worth, Mr. Reed, I was wrong about a lot of things. Doesn't change what's on paper, but maybe it changes what I do with it." He didn't wait for mercy. He just let the sentence hang there like a coat he intended to wear. When they were gone, the room slipped into that late light that makes even steel decide to be gentle. Malcolm pulled the chair beneath the high window and sat with his notebook and the new pen Breen had left him. The ink moved like it had somewhere good to be. "Dear Elijah," he wrote, and stopped, because sometimes a good beginning will sit with you a while before it asks for more. He pictured the boy's face from the visit, the way his mouth had tried to be brave while his eyes worked on something slower. A chrysanthemum drawn in blue, petals like small hands cupped around a truth that didn't need a microphone. He thought about the words that had built the last week, how a man had used them to hurt, and how the same raw materials made a bridge when patience stacked them straight. He thought of the complaint log, verbs and dates, no flourishes, each line tightened down like a bolt. He thought of the television waking up on its own time and telling a room what it already knew in its private places. He thought about the sound the keys made when they left the desk and turned into something lighter than they were on a belt. He didn't have a sermon. He had a memory and a tone. The old men he'd grown up around had taught him there was a difference. A sermon tries to win. A tone tries to keep company. He wrote the way old men tell it, when the day is burned down to a thin blue edge and the lights stop acting like bullies. He wrote about respect without using the word first, because the word had been hired out too often to people who needed a ladder to look honest. He wrote about hands staying steady when the room tilts, about voices choosing low so the work can be loud. He wrote about justice not as a symbol, but as a hinge, oiled, faithful, swinging the same way whether a man is wearing grays or a badge. He wrote that sometimes the door opens and nobody cheers because the noise would scare the good out of it. He wrote that some victories don't want trumpets, they want a chair pulled out and a book placed just so. When his hand cramped, he set the pen down and listened. The building answered with its usual music. Air through the vents, a faraway gate complaining about its job, the soft complaint of a cart 3 corridors over. He got up and walked the aisles one more time. The spines looked back like faces at peace. On the end cap, a beginner's dictionary waited for the first man brave enough to take it without shame. He tucked a note behind it. Start where you are. I'll meet you there. No signature. Pride didn't need one. The door clicked and Soto slid in, shoulders dipped as if sorry to interrupt a church he hadn't planned on entering. You still open? He asked. For 5 more minutes, Malcolm said. Soto nodded toward the repaired book. That the one he stepped on? It was, Malcolm said. Now it's the one that stood back up. The kid grinned sideways. I've been thinking about that word. Leverage. He pronounced it like it finally agreed to sit with him. Feels different now. Words change when you carry them a while, Malcolm said. Like buckets. They start empty, then you feel the oh, wait. Soto's eyes landed on the notebook. You writing to your boy? Trying. You tell him about, all this? Soto waved at a week that had changed the shape of the room. I'm telling him about tomorrow, Malcolm said. He'll hear the rest when it's time. Soto took a step back, then another. Okay, I just wanted to say thanks. For not making it a victory dance. Don't think I could have stomached it. Me neither, Malcolm said. When Soto left, Malcolm locked the door and let the quiet sit beside him like an old friend. He opened the notebook again. The pen waited like a good dog. He wrote, Son, folks will tell you respect is fear dressed in a uniform. Don't buy it. Respect is what you do careful when no one's clapping. It's the way you put a book back where it belongs after somebody tried to teach it shame. It's the way you keep your voice small so truth can be heard doing its work. Justice, if it's worth the print, won't shout either. It'll be the hinge that holds while the house learns to breathe. He paused, smiled at the plainness of it, and added, Some doors opened loudly. Ours didn't. I'm grateful. He signed his name and slipped the page into an envelope addressed in his neat hand. On the way to the desk, he passed the card and put his palm on the handle. The wobble answered, as faithful as a heartbeat. He didn't fix it. Not tonight. A man can live with a reminder that straight is a direction and not always a condition. Clara tapped on the glass, mouthing goodnight through the reflection of the stacks. He lifted 2 fingers. She went, and he was alone with the library's patient bones. He turned off the fluorescence and let the last of the sun have the room. In that half-dark, the window made a square on the floor, and in the middle of that square, the dust rose and fell like breath. He could have sworn, if he let himself, that the shape of it was a flower drawn by a child in blue. He slid the outgoing mail into the slot outside, then came back for the last slow walk. Fingers along spines, a blessing you don't have to be ordained to give. At the door, he paused and listened. Somewhere inside the wall, a hinge moved, quiet and certain. Somewhere down the tier, a lock clicked, not like a threat, but like a promise being kept. He turned the knob, stepped into the corridor, and pulled the door until it kissed the frame. It didn't bang, it didn't need to. Behind him, the library held its shape. Ahead, the hall stretched out under tired lights, the air carrying the faintest tune, maybe a radio, maybe a man humming something he hadn't learned so much as remembered. Malcolm walked toward Count with his shoulders easy and the letter warm against his chest. The night met him without fanfare. Some endings do. The good ones don't end at all. They fold like paper and wait for the next hand to open them.